Hey kiddos, we are in Unit 6. We're going to be looking at imperialism next. And so this term imperialism is a little bit bigger of a term because it's going to encompass many different things, many different types of things. And so I will try to explain the best I can, but if you guys have any questions or understand something, just make sure you reach out. I'm happy to help you guys with that, whatever I can. Okay, so we're going to be in the age of imperialism from about 1800 to about 1914, leading us up to World War I. All right, so the Industrial Revolution transformed the West. It advances science, technology, industry, transportation, communication. All of these things provided many of these Western nations with advantages. So they had new economic and political powers. Western nations basically set out to dominate the world. They wanted to build these extensive overseas empires and then maintain them better than what we had previously learned about in the age of exploration. So we're going to look at the need first. So why, what is the reason for needing to expand and things like that with imperialism? And so it did not begin until about the 1800s. And imperialism is a policy of one country's political, economic, and cultural domination over other land and territories. Now, so we've already learned about the age of exploration, age of discovery in the 14 to 1600s. Places like Spain, Portugal, all those countries ended up having overseas empires, but they didn't. It was hard to maintain because lack of technology. And so this time around, they have the technology needed. And so when this expansion then changes over to empire building, and so really they are focused on places that are going to provide them with natural resources, with a labor force, a place to sell goods. So really the things that we learned about in the Industrial Revolution that a country needs to have in order to industrialize, those factors of production, this is that push to get those factors in place, okay? And so the need for resources drives expansion further. Manufacturers wanted to have access to all of these natural resources like rubber, petroleum, manganese for steel, palm oil for machinery. So they were looking for not necessarily wanting to buy it, but just take it. And so that's where this started really push from. And then you also had some political and military motives. Political and military issues were closely linked to economic motives. Steam-powered merchant ships and naval vessels needed bases around the world to resupply coal. And it was just easier to take a place. Instead of working with a group of people that you had a language barrier with, it was just easier to end up just taking over. Then you also had some humanitarian and religious goals, wanting to spread Christianity, wanting to a lot of the places they went into, especially in Africa, they looked at how they lived their lives as just less. They didn't have the major buildings. They didn't have the indoor plumbing. And so they just automatically looked at those people as less. And so they thought, we're here to basically help you get out of this tough life, even though the people didn't ask for it. They also had the term social Darwinism ended up having its impact. And so Darwin is known for the ideas of natural selection, the ideas of a survival of the fittest, for animals. And so people started taking this idea and applying it to other human races. And so a lot of Europeans argued that all other races were simply inferior. They were less than the white race, so white European race. And that Darwin's idea of natural selection also applied to people. It's an amazing thought. And this is really where we get the foundations of a lot of the modern racism that we still see in our society today. All right, so let's talk about Western imperialism spreads rapidly. From about 1870 to about 1914, imperialist nations gained control over much of the world, leading the way were soldiers, merchants, settlers, missionaries, and explorers. In Europe, imperial expansion found favor in all classes, from bankers and manufactured workers. European imperialism expanded rapidly for a number of reasons. So let's look at those reasons. You had some vulnerable non-Western states, and so there was many areas in the non-Western world that were very vulnerable, whether they had weakened governments because of, a civil war, or just weak governments because of a transition of power. A lot of these non-Western states ended up being very vulnerable to somebody coming in and taking over. And then the West just had a lot of advantages. They had used the Industrial Revolution to really build up their the technology. It ends up becoming weaponry. They were just vastly further advanced than a lot of these non-Western worlds. I mean, you look at many of the tribes of the Aborigines in Australia and many of the African tribes in Africa. They were using different hand type of weaponry, whereas we had but Europeans had Maxim machine guns, and so you see a lot of these advances that were being put into place. Now, there was some resistance to imperialism. People in Africa and Asia strongly resisted Western expansion. Many people fought the invaders, even though they had no weapons equal to the Maxim guns. Rulers in some areas tried to strengthen their societies against outsiders by reforming their own Muslim, Hindu, and Confucian traditions. Although the European powers defeated almost all armed resistance, the struggle against imperialism continued. They never stopped fighting. Many places just simply did not want those people. And so a lot of ill feelings that you see different races have towards Europeans and Americans today come from this time and these people who were doing this. You also had many critics at home who didn't think that we should be exploiting these other nations like this. We should be focused on improving conditions for people in the West rather than trying to impose on other cultures. And so this was an ongoing battle afar and at home. Now, there's different types of imperial rule. The leading imperial powers developed several kinds of colonial rule. Each of the different types reflected different goals for their colonies. And so you had the idea of direct and indirect rule. The French practiced, for example, direct rule, sending officials and soldiers from France to administer the colonies. Their goal was to impose French culture and really just turn these colonies and these provinces into French, basically make them as French as possible. It was a little more expensive, but it was an effective tool of trying to get your point across. The British, however, focused on indirect rule, where basically a British governor and a council of advisors made laws for each colony. Local rulers loyal to the governor retained some authority and served as agents for the British between the locals and the government that's in place. And so you have these two different types, but then you also have some other types of imperial rule. In some places, Western powers practiced or established the idea of a protectorate, where the local rulers were left in place, but were expected to follow the advice of European advisors on issues such as trade or missionary activity. And then you also had the spheres of influence. The third form of Western control was the sphere of influence, which was an area in which an outside power claimed exclusive investment or trading privileges. So still, locals in place, but you had the influence of somebody of a bigger nation. We practice this in the Western Hemisphere as Americans. Now, you have varying effects of imperialism. So Western imperialism had an enormous impact around the world. It affected different places in different ways, but there are some common effects in colonized territories. And so you had some political changes. European nations set up their own governments that reflected their own traditions. But the thing is many traditional African, Asian cultures did not practice or administer government the same way. And so it really had changed the principles of their government. You also had economic changes because many of the colonies were established for things like needing mines and agriculture and stuff like that. And so you ended up changing how the economy was set up from a barter system to more of a money system based upon the products you were trying to take from them. And this ended up growing the money economy throughout the world as well, which is, really one of the arguments why the dollar is still one of the most the most widely accepted form of currency on the planet. You also had social and cultural traditions changed over time, and so this really broke down the cultural traditions of the people that were there. Europeans ended up putting and assimilating much of their culture with these colonies throughout the world. Missionaries ended up winning converts, which spread Christian values throughout the world as well. But then these improvements bring some benefits, but also some disadvantages. Although it broke down some traditional patterns of life, some argue that colonial rule brought vast improvement. Europeans developed their colonies economically. They built railroads, they built hospitals, they built telegraph systems, they built schools. And so a lot of people argue that this was actually a good thing because it got some of these places out of the darkness and kind of into the light of modern technology. But then a lot of people still argue that this isn't necessarily the case, that this led to racism in the world, that the hospitals and clinics dedicated to improving healthcare didn't really do that for the locals, but mostly for the Europeans that were still there. And so this is an argument back and forth, and it's still being argued among historians today. And it's a very interesting argument that I hope you will kind of dive into. Was imperialism, did they need these modern things, or was it simply just something that you didn't necessarily have to partake in? Okay, guys, if you have any questions, please reach out. Talk with you soon.